In this bass lesson, you'll learn whether you should focus on learning scales or learning songs and bass lines. Plus, you'll get the specifics for exactly what to focus on for your specific situation. Hi, I'm Luke from becomeabassist.com, and if you want the roadmap for what I recommend you learn at every stage of your bass playing journey, then keep watching. This lesson comes from a question asked by an email subscriber named Craig, who asked about how to split your practice time between learning scales on bass versus learning songs or bass lines. Now, it is a great question, but it's also a very individual one. There's no single correct answer for everyone, but there is probably a right answer for you personally, and it'll depend a lot on what you want to do with your bass and the kind of music that you want to play. So right now, I want to give you 3 common scenarios and what I'd recommend for someone at each different level. You might find yourself fitting nicely into one of these, or you might be somewhere in between, and that's fine as well. Level 1 would be an absolute beginner, or someone who's coming back to playing bass after a long time away from it. Now, if this sounds like you, then frankly, I wouldn't suggest you dive straight into learning a bunch of different scales. If you're at this level, there are plenty of other big wins that will be way more useful for you at this stage. Things like sorting out your technique will be a huge win. Learning to lock in with a drummer, learning how to groove, another huge win. Learning to match pitch and start learning by ear, that's a third big win. Learning random scales at the start of your journey, it's not going to make a big difference for you yet. I remember when I first started teaching bass. I was young and kind of an idiot. One of my first students was this young guy in maybe 13 or 14 years old. At the time, I was deep into learning scales, doing scale exercises, all that kind of stuff. So when I gave him his first lesson, that's all that I wanted to talk about. Scales and string crossing and blah, blah, blah. This poor guy, he was just starting out. So I was rambling about different groupings, string crossing, and of course what happens? His eyes glaze over, he's bored out of his mind, and it was totally my fault. At the end of this lesson, or really lesson, it comes out that this kid really wants to learn this one specific Green Day song. Now, I didn't know it, so I went away to find it and came back the next week. This is, of course, before YouTube on smartphones was a thing. So this time, we start by learning this song, and instead of his eyes glazing over and him being bored out of his mind, his eyes totally light up. He's super into it, he's playing along, he's smiling, and he's getting way more out of it than listening to me talk about scale shapes. This is why at the very start, I recommend you focus on things other than scales. Not only will it be more useful to you to focus on learning songs, technique, how to groove, working your ear, but it'll also be a hell of a lot more fun. And by the way, learning songs can actually help you develop your groove, and if you're learning without resorting to finding charts or tabs, then you're working your ear as well, and that's a double win. Now, if you start learning this way, you'll play more, you'll start developing a practice habit, and you'll be hooked on playing bass. Now, if at this stage you really do want to learn some scales, maybe you want to stretch your creativity a bit, the ones I recommend you learn at the very start are the major and minor pentatonic scales. Now, why these ones? It's because they're incredibly versatile, you can do a ton of stuff with them, and they're pretty easy to get your head around. You could also dabble in some blues scale stuff as well. If you learn your minor pentatonic, all you have to do is add one note. Couldn't be simpler. In terms of percentages, how much to split your practice time, I'd probably suggest at this stage 90% would be dedicated to learning things other than scales, the things I talked about before, learning songs, technique, working your ear. And the rest of the 10%, if you wanted to, you could learn some scales. So what about level number 2? If you're not a beginner anymore and you want to take your playing to that next level, to a sort of intermediate place. This might be if you've learned a bunch of songs and you're comfortable playing your bass, but you're getting kind of bored with your playing. You find yourself playing the same kinds of things over and over again. Or maybe you want to start to get a little bit more serious. You want to start maybe improvising, making more and more creative fills, maybe even start taking some bass solos. One thing to note here is that in general, it's kind of rare to see an entire scale from bottom to top or top to bottom in bass lines. There are a few exceptions. Check out the chorus to Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song or Nina Simone's recording of My Baby Just Cares For Me. Both use scales in this way, very kind of linearly. Now, because entire scales in bass lines are rare, in this second level, you'll probably start using scales to play melodies. And after all, that's what bass solos and bass fills are. They're just melodies played on the bass. So if that's the case, then it might be time for you to delve a little deeper into the world of scales. That's why in the second level, I really recommend you get to know the modes of the major scale. If you know these really well, a whole world will suddenly open up to you. You'll be able to know exactly what to play in maybe 80 to 90% of situations. If someone calls on you to take a solo, you'll know what notes are going to work the best, how they relate to each of the chords, and you'll have the confidence to play just about anything without having to worry about any wrong notes. Yes, it will take some practice to get there, but once you nail it, it's a skill that you'll have for the rest of your life, and that's pretty cool. If you want to do all this, I've actually got the perfect thing for you. It's called The Ultimate Guide to the Modes for Bass. It's a set of 2 videos plus a 16-page PDF that goes through the modes in detail, how to play them, and most importantly, how to use them. Yeah, it's 100% free, and you can get it by clicking the first link in the description of this video. Just click that link, fill out the form on that page, and I'll send it straight to your email address, as well as 24 different practice tracks that are made that will help you start mastering the modes today. So check it out. At this level, you can start playing music that uses slightly more complex harmonies, things like major 7 chords, minor 7 chords, dominant 7 chords, plus all of their extensions. Genres like funk, blues, some soul, some jazz that's kind of a bit more straightforward. All these genres use extended harmony that works incredibly well with the modes of the major scale. In terms of percentages between learning songs and scales, it probably bumps it up to being roughly 50-50, but you can tweak it for yourself. If you have songs you need to learn for whatever reason, then go for it. And if you have less songs to learn at whatever time, go hard on the scale stuff. Let's move on to level 3. This is where you're at quite an advanced level and the music you're playing is getting more and more harmonically complex. So if you're playing more kind of hardcore jazz, certain kinds of metal, especially the prog stuff, certain types of gospel music, and tons of non-Western music. If you're playing any of these, then you really do need to start thinking about expanding your scale toolbox. Things like getting familiar with the melodic minor scale and the harmonic minor scale, plus all of their modes, that's going to be super useful to you. Learning the different kinds of diminished scales as well as bebop scales, and of course the big one, the chromatic scale, also going to be super helpful. If you're playing any kind of non-Western music, then you might have to learn some scales that are specific to whatever kind of genre you're playing. At this level as well, a lot of the time by learning songs, you're actually learning scales as well, or at least little fractions of scales. And what's more is that if you're playing improvised music, you can start to bend and even break the rules you've learned up until this point. You can create scale hybrids on the fly and use chromaticism to enhance whatever you're playing. Not only is this a ton of fun, but when you get it right, almost nothing is as satisfying. In terms of percentages of scales versus learning songs, it probably swings back to learning more songs than scales. Once you get the hang of the first 2 levels, you'll find it gets easier and easier to learn scales because now you have somewhere to work from. You have a framework to kind of judge everything else against. One final point before I let you go, learning scales doesn't mean you lose creativity. That is a total myth that some people use as an excuse to avoid putting in the work of broadening your musical options. If anything, scales can actually enhance your creativity because they give you parameters to work within. You can push and pull on those parameters as much as you want, but only if you know where they are. You can go outside the scales for a little bit, see how it sounds and feels. But if you don't know where those boundaries are, chances are you won't see much real improvement in this area. You'll probably just keep playing the same things you always have, and your playing ends up stagnating. In any case, as long as you're always learning, always trying to improve, it's all good. To recap though, you learned what I recommend you do at each stage of your development. You learned at the very beginning level, you don't really need to focus on scales. There are much bigger wins that will help you a lot more. At this stage, if you really wanted to, check out the major and minor pentatonics, maybe even the blues scale. Level 2, I recommend you dive deep into the modes of the major scale because they're incredibly versatile and will cover you for 80 to 90% of situations. Then in level 3, when you get really advanced or start playing music that's really harmonically complex, you have to start looking into more esoteric, more exotic scales, things like diminished harmony, bebop scales, the modes of the melodic and harmonic minor, all that kind of thing. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. Make sure and download my ultimate guide to the modes for bass. It'll give you a huge head start on your scales and it's all free, so click that first link in the description. I'm Luke from becomeabassist.com and I'll see you in another video.